Friends, something much bigger than another political argument is unfolding between the United States and Canada. What we're watching isn't simply a disagreement over tariffs, borders, or political leverage. It's a confrontation between two economies that have spent decades building one of the most interconnected trading relationships on Earth. The United States and Canada don't operate like two completely separate economies. Their factories share supply chains, their energy systems are deeply connected, and their businesses depend heavily on customers across the border. When Washington changes the rules, Canadian companies feel it, but American companies can feel the consequences too. That's what makes this situation so complicated. Politicians can announce a tariff in a matter of minutes, but businesses may need months or even years to restructure around it. A decision that looks simple from Washington or Ottawa can become incredibly complicated once it reaches factories, farms, transportation companies, retailers, and ordinary consumers. Donald Trump has repeatedly presented tariffs as an economic weapon. The basic argument is that America's enormous consumer market gives Washington leverage over countries that depend on access to American buyers. If another country wants access to that market, the argument goes it should be willing to make concessions. There is a certain logic behind that strategy. The United States does have enormous economic power, and access to its market is extremely valuable. The problem is that economic power doesn't automatically mean economic victory, especially when the country on the other side of the negotiation is deeply connected to your own economy. Canada isn't simply another foreign supplier. Canadian energy, agricultural products, minerals, lumber, machinery, and industrial inputs are connected to American businesses in ways that have developed over generations. American companies have built their production systems around the assumption that this cross-border relationship would remain relatively predictable. That assumption matters. Businesses make long-term investments based on expected costs, stable regulations, and reliable suppliers. If those assumptions suddenly change, companies don't simply complain and continue operating exactly as before. They begin reconsidering contracts, suppliers, factories, inventories, hiring decisions, and investment plans. And this is where tariffs become much more complicated than political speeches suggest. A tariff is imposed on imported goods, but the economic cost doesn't necessarily remain with the foreign producer. Importers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and consumers can all potentially absorb different portions of that additional cost. Imagine an American company that buys an important component from Canada. If the tariff increases the company's cost, management has several options. It can accept lower profits, increase the price of its product, find another supplier, reduce production, or some combination of all four. None of those choices is free. If the company raises prices, American consumers may pay more. If it changes suppliers, the new supplier may be more expensive or less efficient. If it reduces production, workers in local communities can eventually feel the impact through slower hiring or reduced investment. Now consider the automobile industry, where the relationship becomes even more complicated. Modern North American vehicles are rarely produced entirely inside one country. Components can cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle reaches the consumer. That system wasn't created by accident. Companies spent decades building factories and supply networks around the idea that goods could move efficiently throughout North America. The entire system was designed to reduce costs, increase specialization, and make American, Canadian, and Mexican production work together. A sudden trade barrier can interfere with that system. A factory can't simply relocate overnight. A supplier can't instantly replace a decades-old contract. A transportation network can't be redesigned in a weekend. And workers can't instantly move from one industry to another because a government changed a tariff schedule. This is why uncertainty may be just as important as the tariff itself. Companies can sometimes adapt to a known cost, even if that cost is unpleasant. What they struggle with is not knowing whether today's rules will still exist 6 months or 1 year from now. Imagine you're running a manufacturing company and considering a major expansion. You could invest millions of dollars in a new facility, hire hundreds of workers, and sign long-term contracts. But if you don't know what the trade environment will look like next year, you may decide to wait. That decision doesn't necessarily appear in the headlines. Nobody sees the factory that wasn't built or the workers who were never hired. but thousands of companies making similar decisions can eventually have a measurable impact on economic growth and investment. This is why businesses pay such close attention to government policy. They don't just care about whether tariffs exist today. They care about whether the rules are predictable enough to make long-term decisions with confidence. Canada also understands this reality. Ottawa may have less overall economic power than Washington, but Canada possesses resources and strategic advantages that give it meaningful leverage in negotiations. Energy is one of the clearest examples. The United States and Canada have developed a highly integrated energy relationship over many decades. American refineries, industries, utilities, and consumers are connected to Canadian energy supplies. While Canada relies heavily on access to the American market, that means the relationship is not simply America buying Canadian products. It is a two-way system in which both economies benefit from integration. Canada needs American customers, but American businesses also depend on Canadian resources and infrastructure. This mutual dependence is one reason a prolonged trade war could become uncomfortable for both sides. Washington can impose economic pressure on Canada, but Ottawa has the ability to respond in ways that create costs for American companies and consumers. Canada can target selected American exports with retaliatory measures. It can encourage Canadian consumers to buy domestic alternatives. It can seek new international markets. It can use the political importance of particular industries to increase pressure on American policymakers. But retaliation isn't free either. Canadian businesses can also suffer from higher costs, reduced access to American customers, and disrupted supply chains. That's why neither side should confuse the ability to cause pain with the ability to achieve a lasting economic victory. This is the central problem with trade wars. Two countries can successfully hurt each other without either country actually becoming stronger. One side raises barriers, the other retaliates. Companies adjust, consumers pay more, and politicians on both sides declare that they are standing up for national interests. Meanwhile, economic efficiency can deteriorate underneath the political noise. Companies may start paying more for inputs, transportation routes may become less efficient, and investment decisions may be delayed. The economy doesn't necessarily collapse, but it can become more expensive and less productive. This is also where Mark Carney's economic background becomes relevant. Carney has extensive experience in central banking and international finance, including leadership of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. His professional background gives him a perspective shaped by financial stability, monetary policy, and global economic institutions. Donald Trump's background is very different. His experience comes primarily from business, real estate, media, and politics. And his economic philosophy places significant emphasis on bargaining power and protection of American industries. These differences naturally produce different approaches to economic policy. But the important question isn't which leader has the more impressive resume. The important question is whether the policies being pursued actually improve economic conditions for the people they are supposed to help. That's where the conversation needs to become much more serious. Instead of asking whether a politician sounds tough, we should ask whether investment is increasing, whether workers are benefiting, whether manufacturing is becoming more competitive, and whether consumers are facing higher or lower costs. Those are measurable questions. Political speeches can change from one day to another, but economic data eventually reveals what businesses and consumers are actually experiencing. This is also why personal attacks can become a distraction. Calling one leader brilliant and another leader incompetent doesn't tell us whether a particular tariff policy will succeed. Economic policy is complicated enough that even experienced policymakers can make mistakes, and even controversial politicians can occasionally make effective decisions. The economy doesn't care about political personalities. Supply chains respond to prices. Businesses respond to incentives. Investors respond to risk. Consumers respond to prices and availability. Those reactions eventually determine whether a policy succeeds or fails. One of the biggest dangers in the current confrontation is therefore not simply the size of the tariffs. It is the possibility that uncertainty becomes permanent. Businesses need predictable rules. They can plan around a known cost, even if that cost is high. But if tariffs appear, disappear, increase, decrease, and change from one month to the next, companies may become reluctant to make long-term commitments. Think about a small American manufacturer that imports Canadian materials. The owner needs to decide how much inventory to purchase, whether to sign a long-term supplier contract, and whether to hire additional employees. If the trade rules are stable, those decisions are difficult but manageable. If the rules are constantly changing, every decision becomes a gamble. Large multinational corporations have resources to manage that uncertainty. They can hire lawyers, economists, customs experts, and supply chain consultants. A small business may have only a few employees and far less financial flexibility. That difference matters. A large company may survive a sudden increase in costs by changing suppliers. A small company might simply raise prices, reduce hiring, or stop expanding. And when thousands of small businesses make those decisions simultaneously, the effect can spread throughout the economy. This is how a trade policy eventually reaches ordinary households. It doesn't always arrive as a dramatic economic crisis. Sometimes it appears as a slightly higher price, a delayed construction project, postponed factory expansion, or a business deciding not to hire another employee. Those effects can be difficult to see individually. But when they happen across thousands of companies and millions of consumers, they become economically important. Supporters of tariffs would argue that these costs can be justified if tariffs encourage more domestic production. That argument deserves to be taken seriously. The United States has legitimate concerns about supply chain resilience, industrial capacity, national security, and dependence on foreign production. There are industries where maintaining domestic capabilities may be strategically valuable even if domestic production costs more. The real question is whether tariffs are producing those desired outcomes. If tariffs encourage companies to build new factories, hire workers, and develop domestic supply chains, that is an important benefit. But if tariffs mainly increase costs without generating enough new investment or productivity, then the economic trade-off becomes much less attractive. That's why the results matter more than the announcement. When a tariff is announced, politicians can immediately claim that something important has happened. But the real economic test comes later, when companies begin changing their behavior. Are American manufacturers investing more? Are factories expanding? Are workers receiving better opportunities? Are consumers paying higher prices? Are companies moving production back to the United States? Are they simply moving production from one foreign country to another? Those questions tell us far more than political speeches ever will. The same standard should apply to Canada. If Canadian retaliation protects important industries and gives Ottawa meaningful negotiating leverage, it may serve a strategic purpose. But if retaliation mainly increases costs for Canadian households and businesses, Canadians will eventually question whether the strategy is worth it. There is no completely free economic weapon. Every tariff creates a response. Every retaliation creates another response. Every supply chain disruption creates a new incentive for companies to adapt. And once businesses adapt, some of those changes may become permanent. That's another major risk that policymakers need to consider. Trade relationships are built over decades. But supply chains can begin changing surprisingly quickly once companies believe the old system is no longer reliable. An American company might find a new supplier outside Canada. A Canadian manufacturer might find customers in Europe or Asia. A company might decide to build its next facility somewhere else entirely. Once, but those decisions are made, the old relationship may never return to exactly what it was before. This means the long-term consequences of a trade war can be much bigger than the original tariff. The question isn't simply how much money the government collects today. The question is how businesses reorganize themselves tomorrow, and that is why the United States and Canada need to be careful about. Allowing temporary political disagreements to become permanent economic separation, the two countries have something extremely valuable: proximity, infrastructure, investment, shared markets, and decades of established business relationships. Those advantages are difficult for other countries to replicate. A company operating in North America can move goods between major markets relatively efficiently. Workers, suppliers, transportation networks, and financial institutions are already connected. Breaking those connections apart would create costs that aren't necessarily visible. When the first tariff is announced, this is where political incentives can become dangerous. A leader may feel pressure to appear strong. Backing down can be portrayed as weakness. Negotiating can be described as surrender. Once both governments start thinking in those terms, compromise becomes much harder. The danger is that economic policy becomes a competition over who can claim victory rather than a serious attempt to improve economic outcomes. But changing policy isn't necessarily weakness. If evidence shows that a strategy is creating more damage than benefit, adjusting that strategy can be a sign of responsible leadership. The strongest negotiator isn't necessarily the person who threatens the most. Sometimes the strongest negotiator is the person who understands exactly how much pressure is necessary to achieve a goal and knows when additional pressure becomes counterproductive. That distinction could determine where this trade confrontation eventually goes. Washington has enormous economic power, but that power has limits. Ottawa has fewer economic resources, but it has its own leverage through energy, resources, geography, and political relationships. Neither side can completely ignore the other, and neither side can completely avoid the economic consequences of escalation. That's why the most important question isn't whether America can hurt Canada or whether Canada can hurt America. The real question is whether either country can emerge from the confrontation with a stronger economy. If the answer is yes, the evidence should eventually appear in investment, productivity, employment, industrial output, and business confidence. If the answer is no, the economic costs will eventually become visible through higher prices and slower growth. This is why ordinary Americans should watch more than political headlines. Watch corporate earnings reports. Watch what manufacturers say about input costs. Watch whether companies are expanding factories or delaying projects. Watch energy markets. Watch transportation costs. Watch consumer prices. Watch whether Canadian and American businesses are actually changing their long-term supply chains. Those indicators can tell us what is happening beneath the political surface. The same is true for negotiations. A political statement can dominate the news for 24 hours. A trade agreement can reshape business decisions for 20 years. That's why the eventual agreement, if one is reached, may matter far more than today's political confrontation. The best outcome would not necessarily be the agreement that allows one leader to claim total victory. It would be the agreement that creates predictable rules while addressing legitimate economic concerns on both sides. Businesses don't need politicians to agree on everything. They need to know what the rules will be. Investors don't need perfect conditions. They need enough stability to justify putting capital at risk. Workers don't need political slogans. They need productive companies that can afford to hire them. Consumers don't need another political victory. They need goods and services at prices they can actually afford. That is the real economic scoreboard, and it is a scoreboard that neither Washington nor Ottawa can control completely. Markets will react, companies will adapt, consumers will change their purchasing decisions, investors will move capital, and eventually, those individual decisions will determine the economic outcome. This is why the trade war should not be treated as a simple battle between two personalities. It is a much larger test of economic strategy. Can tariffs create meaningful negotiating leverage without creating excessive domestic costs? Can Canada retaliate without damaging its own economy? Can both governments preserve critical supply chains? Can businesses continue investing despite uncertainty? And can political leaders recognize when negotiation is more valuable than escalation? Those are the questions that matter, because the United States and Canada are not going to stop being neighbors. Their geography isn't changing. Their energy infrastructure isn't disappearing. Their businesses aren't suddenly going to forget decades of commercial relationships. The relationship will continue. The only question is what that relationship will look like after the trade confrontation ends. Will the two countries remain deeply integrated? Or will companies gradually build separate supply chains because they no longer trust the stability of the North American market? That second possibility deserves serious attention. Economic integration creates efficiency, but it also creates dependence. When that dependence becomes politically uncomfortable, governments may try to reduce it. But reducing dependence can be expensive. It may require duplicate factories, alternative suppliers, new transportation routes, additional inventory, and higher operating costs. Those expenses don't disappear. They eventually become part of the cost of doing business, and that cost can eventually reach consumers. This is why the debate needs to be much more sophisticated than simply saying tariffs are good or tariffs are bad. Some tariffs can serve legitimate strategic purposes. Some can protect emerging industries. Some can create bargaining leverage, but tariffs can also create unintended consequences. The question is always the same. What are we getting in return? If the United States pays higher costs but gains stronger domestic production and greater strategic resilience, policymakers can argue that the trade-off is worthwhile. If the United States pays higher costs and receives little in return, then the strategy deserves criticism. The same logic applies to Canada. Canada has every right to protect its interests. But retaliation must also be judged by results. If retaliation strengthens Canada's negotiating position, it has strategic value. If it simply increases costs for Canadian businesses and consumers, then eventually the policy becomes difficult to defend. This is what makes economic policy different from political. Political theater can survive contradiction. Economic policy eventually cannot. A politician can say the economy is strong, but if businesses stop investing, that eventually matters. A government can say tariffs are harmless, but if companies repeatedly report higher costs, that eventually matters. A leader can claim victory, but if consumers are paying more and workers are losing opportunities, the public eventually notices. Reality has a way of catching up, and that's why this trade confrontation should be watched over months and years rather than judged entirely by individual headlines. The first reaction is often emotional. Markets may move. Sharply, politicians may celebrate. Critics may attack, but the long-term outcome is determined by what happens after the initial shock. Do companies adapt successfully? Do consumers absorb the costs? Do factories expand? Do supply chains become more resilient? Do negotiations reduce uncertainty? Those are the real indicators. There is still a path toward a better outcome. The United States can defend its economic interests without permanently damaging its relationship with Canada. Canada can defend its sovereignty and industries without creating unnecessary long-term barriers to American trade. Both sides can negotiate, both sides can compromise, and both sides can recognize that economic cooperation and national interests don't have to be opposites. In fact, the strongest North American economy may be one where both countries remain competitive while maintaining efficient trade where it makes sense. That doesn't mean eliminating disagreements. It means managing them intelligently. Because the goal of economic policy should not be to create the most dramatic headline. The goal should be to create the strongest possible economic foundation for ordinary people. That's the standard that matters. Not whether a politician sounded aggressive, not whether a political base celebrated, not whether one government claimed that it had forced the other side to surrender. The real question is what happened to people's lives. Did wages improve? Did employment improve? Did businesses invest? Did productivity increase? Did prices remain manageable? Did supply chains become stronger? Those are the questions that history will eventually use to judge this period, and that is why Americans should resist the temptation to view the trade war entirely through partisan politics. You don't have to love Donald Trump to recognize that tariffs can sometimes have strategic purposes. You don't have to support Mark Carney to recognize that Canada has legitimate economic interests. You don't have to choose a political team to understand basic economics. The facts matter more than the personalities, and the facts will eventually become visible. If the strategy works, the numbers will show it. If the strategy fails, the numbers will show that too. No political speech can permanently hide economic reality. That's the uncomfortable part of this entire debate. Both sides have powerful arguments. Both sides have vulnerabilities. Both sides have leverage, and both sides have something to lose. America risks higher costs and supply chain disruption. Canada risks reduced access to its most important market. Businesses on both sides risk uncertainty, consumers on both sides risk higher prices, and workers on both sides risk slower investment. If companies decide that the North American market has confesses slatter inessos. Slatter American marketives, that's upredicts abishite poshite patuizachilate. Lashanishalishanish specianiships, if is pepsipesepsepsepsepsa, and sepsepsa, but step pepsip of a pampa bim and to die and Adam acid I so I got so I found so by my boy I'm all the other element that do it I'm a mood of the rather than follow when it over here either me or I to purposes to put over the summer of an is what I did sort of I'm an away for the brother that was an image when it's for unpermitted sim and moment was took it off the every additional retaliation makes the relationship more complicated, and every new barrier makes it slightly harder to return to the old system. The goal should therefore be to use economic leverage carefully rather than endlessly. Pressure can create negotiations. Too much pressure can create permanent restructuring. There is a difference, and recognizing that difference may be the most important economic judgment facing policymakers right now. The United States has the world's largest economy and enormous bargaining power. Canada has strategic resources, geographic importance, and deep integration with American industries. Neither side should underestimate the other, but neither side should overestimate its own ability to control the outcome. Because once governments change the rules, markets respond in ways that governments cannot completely predict. A company may move production, a consumer may change brands, an investor may move capital, a farmer may find a new customer, a farmer may find a new copperer, a farmer may manufacture, millions of supplies, millions of ends of. That's why it's where, why it's wall, waits. What it's about, but it's all about, map self, some spout, and my hand where, why I'm with it, I said, where I was, and we was, was it, Morris, and without a despill of the wood, of the solid, what it out, so it's the mother of trust. Businesses need to trust that cross-border relationships will remain viable. Investors need to trust that rules won't constantly change. Consumers need to trust that supply will remain available. And governments need to trust that negotiations can produce agreements that both sides can actually maintain. If that trust disappears, the economic consequences could last far longer than any individual political administration. That's the real long-term risk, not one announcement, not one tariff, not one retaliation, but the possibility that businesses begin permanently planning for a world in which the United States and Canada are less economically connected. That would be a major change, and it could take years to reverse. So as this story develops, ignore the temptation to focus only on who insulted whom. Ignore the political theater. Ignore the constant declarations of victory. Look at the underlying economic indicators. Look at investment. Look at production. Look at prices. Look at employment. Look at energy. Look at trade volumes. Look at corporate decisions. And most importantly, look at whether the policies are producing the outcomes their supporters promised. Because that's the only test that really matters. The United States doesn't need to surrender its economic interests. Canada doesn't need to surrender its interests either. Both countries can negotiate from positions of strength while recognizing that strength doesn't require destroying mutually beneficial relationships. A successful negotiation doesn't have to produce a loser. Sometimes the best outcome is one where both countries walk away with enough to claim that their interests were protected. That's how long-term economic relationships survive political disagreements, and that's ultimately what North America needs: predictability. Investment, competitive industries, reliable supply chains, affordable energy, strong workers, and businesses confident enough to build for the future. If policymakers can achieve those things, the political drama will eventually become a footnote. But if the confrontation produces years of uncertainty and economic fragmentation, the consequences could become much more difficult to reverse. The final judgment, therefore, shouldn't be made today. It should be made after the data arrives. After businesses respond, after consumers adjust, after factories make investment decisions, after negotiations produce whatever agreement eventually emerges. That's when we'll know whether this strategy created genuine economic strength or simply created an expensive political confrontation. And when that answer becomes clear, it won't come from a campaign speech, it won't come from a social media post, it won't come from a television debate, it will come from the economy itself. The economy always keeps the score. So watch the numbers, watch the companies, watch the factories, watch the energy markets, watch the supply chains, and watch what happens when political promises finally collide with economic reality. Because when the cameras turn off, politicians can move on to the next headline. Businesses can't. Workers can't. Families can't. They have to live with the consequences. And that is why the US-Canada trade confrontation deserves serious attention. It's because of the personalities involved, but because of the economic system underneath them. Two neighboring countries have spent generations building an extraordinary commercial relationship. They now have a choice. They can use their economic power to negotiate a better relationship, or they can use that power in a way that slowly damages the relationship itself. The difference between those two outcomes could affect businesses and consumers on both sides of the border for years. And that is the real story. Not who shouted the loudest, not who claimed victory first, not who appeared strongest on television. The real story is whether ordinary Americans and Canadians become economically stronger when this confrontation is finally over. Because in the end, trade policy isn't about winning an argument. It's about building an economy that works. And if the leaders on both sides remember that there is still a path forward, if they forget it, the political victory may come at a very high economic price. And that price will eventually be Kent. And that price will eventually. You will henschelent influential to winchulent and plant. Princhim centra and tabayman some whimsin, some symptom, up some wintem, but so frabum, up can was in as a fem, it have to esset and wet I answer with I want us, mutted us, and what out to call the color to someone I women and added to put her to my word, I would order I said the decision